And now we will go from the network to the school to policy questions. We have Beatrice with us, Andrews, and she works in the policylabb in the UK cabinet. Welcome up, Beatrice.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I've worked in the policylabb since we set it up in April 2016. 2014 in the UK government. That came out, the lab itself came out of the UK Civil Service Reform Plan, where it was recognised that government needed to do things differently. It was sort of felt like there was a burning platform. It was like, the usual stuff isn't working. Big financial crisis in 2008, followed by austerity in the new coalition government, and a feeling that we really needed to do stuff differently. There'd been, prior to the reform plan, a report by the Design Commission, which came from an all-party group of MPs, saying we need to bring sort of people into the centre of the policy making and use design principles to do that. There's loads of really interesting stuff going on outside in the private sector, but we're not seeing it being used kind of consistently, certainly in government. So the Civil Service Reform Plan said, we want to open up policy, we want to design with implementation in mind, we want to put people at the centre. And they also said, oh, and there's a really cool thing in Denmark called Mind Lab, so we'd like something a little bit like that. And of course, colleagues showing some of the images from Mind Lab later. So I've sort of, earlier, so I've sort of sought to, I think what I want to do now is not to talk so much about our process, because I think we've seen some of that in the earlier presentation, but just talk about the way in which it's kind of received in government and the sort of challenges of trying to do this in the civil service, you know, in a democracy where ministers are ultimately accountable, and you know, it's big, it's complex, there are constraints, it's difficult to do, but I think there have been some sort of small successes along the way. So the idea of the policylabb, we're a really small unit, there's 8 people, and that's the biggest we've ever been. Andrea Siodmok, who's our head of lab, is a designer. She worked for the product designer by training, and she worked for the Design Council before she came to government. I think one of the reasons that we've managed to kind of make this work so far is having that mix of designers, people with that experience, with policymakers like myself and colleagues who have kind of experienced the sort of pain and the challenges and the kind of excitement of policymaking in central government. And I think it's being able to bridge the gap between those two worlds that's been a really important thing to do. And create the kind of permissions, the condition, the space for civil servants to kind of work in ways that they haven't necessarily been used to. We've sought to work on 3 levels, and there was a very clear brief from the Cabinet Secretary, from others, that we needed to be building the skills and knowledge. So this isn't about us being a consultancy and just kind of parachuting ourselves into a department, doing some work, kind of handing it back, see you later. This is very much a kind of collaborative effort with all of our projects. And it's about building the skills and knowledge of the policymakers themselves, so they've got the capability, but also, I think crucially, the confidence to go out and use some of these methods to talk directly with the people who are affected by their services, to sort of engage in a much more constructive way than they've perhaps been used to. It's quite frightening as a civil servant sometimes going out. There can be quite combative kind of rooms full of people who are not necessarily, and it's difficult to move that into a kind of constructive discussion. So part of the methods and tools that we introduce people to is to sort of try and create that neutrality and that level playing field. And sometimes we can do it by virtue of just sort of not being the department and being seen as slightly removed and slightly independent, albeit we are still part of the Cabinet Office and government. And what we've also sought to do is that sort of third layer of inspiring new thinking, kind of looking out for interesting innovations outside and bringing those into government. I'm not going to talk too much about. This is sort of broadly the process that we follow, but as Lisa said earlier, it's a sort of a gross simplicity. It's really considerably more complex and much less linear than that. But broadly, this idea of going out, of sort of trying to understand and define the problem, which may well change kind of a lot throughout that process, going out using ethnographic research techniques, so spending time with people, understanding the world from their perspective, understanding their lives, and potentially combining that with sort of bigger data. The UK government's got a sort of a developing data science capacity, and we also work with external data science agencies. So we've got both the sort of what's happening from that big data and then drilling down into the sort of why it might be happening through that direct engagement with people. And frankly, in many ways, the first bit is sort of the easiest bit to get done in government, partly because civil servants are they're used to commissioning research, they're used to getting the results of research, and being able to sort of deal with them and kind of, get interesting stuff from them. We might have a bit of a kind of battle at the beginning about ethnographic approaches, and particularly because we don't tend to work with a large numbers of people. It's not about representativeness, it's about getting sort of a depth understanding of what's happening. So we might only talk to kind of 8, 10, 12 people who are directly affected by the service. Sometimes we have a mix of sort of users or people who are affected by the policy and those who are delivering it. But it's not a large number of people, and some policymakers will just say, there's no way I can go to the minister and say we're basing this policy on the experience of 8 people. And of course it's not just about that, but we've sometimes had to meet in the middle a bit more and kind of talk to more people than we actually think it's possibly necessary to do, just to kind of meet some of that. But broadly, once they're kind of on board with that, and they get the results and the insights from the ethnography, we use a lot of film. That's taken a while to get people used to receiving information in that way. Normally civil servants get reports, they'll sit there at their desks and read them. They can kind of engage with that, or they don't read them, which might be the other thing. Am I nearly out of time already? It's gone very quickly. But they... Anyway, basically, when they get the results of the ethnography, they quite like it. But the second part of it, hopefully we can have some more time for this in the discussion, the kind of developing ideas and starting to try and test and prototype them is really tough in government. The systems are sort of not there. Increasingly, government doesn't have the leverage over the bodies, or over organisations that are delivering for them on the ground. Even with local authorities now in the United Kingdom, there's sort of less and less money being sent from central government to them, so they're having to work in a much more collaborative way from the start, and that's what we seek to do in our projects, in order to kind of to ensure that ongoing commitment. Do I need to stop there? I will stop there. I had loads more to say, but hopefully we'll be able to talk about some of it in the discussion and the break afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Beatrice, please.